The morning of the 3rd of February, 2004, broke over Palmetto Bay with the routine predictability of any other Tuesday in the sprawling suburbs of Miami-Dade County. It was a day defined by the mundane rhythms of suburban life, where the humidity of South Florida lingered in the air and traffic clogged the arteries leading to the local schools. In this affluent, quiet corner of the county, safety was an assumption, not a concern. Parents navigated their minivans through the drop-off lines, watching their children disappear into the brick-and-mortar embrace of the education system, confident that the worst thing their sons or daughters would face that day might be a difficult math quiz or the social sting of a cafeteria slight. At the center of this community stood Southwood Middle School, a highly regarded institution known specifically as a center for the arts. It was a magnet school, a place that drew in the bright, the talented, and the ambitious. This was an environment designed to nurture creativity and academic excellence, filled with students who played violins, painted canvases, and maintained honor roll grade point averages. Among the sea of adolescents shuffling through the corridors that morning was 14-year-old Michael Hernandez. To the casual observer, and indeed to the teachers and administrators who saw him every day, Michael was the archetype of a well-behaved student. He was average in height, wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a studious appearance, and carried himself with a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He was an honor student, a boy who seemingly followed the rules and caused no trouble. He did not fit the stereotypical profile of a troublemaker or a delinquent. There were no visible warning signs on his face, no scars of outward aggression, and no history of violent outbursts in the classroom that would have flagged him as a threat to the safety of the student body. He blended perfectly into the background of middle school life, a camouflage of normalcy that he wore with chilling effectiveness. Michael arrived at school that morning carrying a heavy backpack, much like every other 8th grader navigating the crowded hallways. The bag contained the standard tools of academia: binders, textbooks, pencils, and homework assignments due for the day's classes. However, nestled deep within the nylon fabric, hidden beneath the layers of schoolwork, lay a collection of items that shattered the illusion of the innocent scholar. He had packed a pair of gloves. He had packed a serrated knife. He had packed a jacket to cover his clothes. These were not the impulsive additions of a child acting out in sudden anger. They were the calculated provisions of a predator preparing for a hunt. The face Michael Hernandez presented to the world that morning remained impassive, betraying nothing of the dark intent weighing down his shoulders. He walked the halls with a pulse that barely quickened, masking a mind that had drifted far away from algebra and civics into a realm of violent fantasy. Waiting for him in the morning shuffle was Jaime Goff. Jaime was also 14, a bright and gentle boy who played the violin and shared a close friendship with Michael. They were best friends, a term that in middle school signifies a deep and trusting bond. They shared classes, they shared jokes, and they shared the awkward transition from childhood to young adulthood. Jaime looked at Michael and saw a companion, a peer with whom he could discuss video games and homework. He saw the face of a friend. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the boy standing next to him, the boy he trusted implicitly, had spent the previous nights meticulously planning his execution. The betrayal inherent in the events of that morning began long before a weapon was drawn. It began with the smile Michael offered Jaime, a gesture of camaraderie that concealed a lethal objective. The interactions between the two boys that morning were terrifyingly normal. Witnesses would later recall seeing them together, standing around before the first bell, perhaps talking about the day ahead or the trivialities that dominate the minds of 14-year-olds. The bustling noise of the hallway, the slamming of lockers, and the chatter of hundreds of students created a chaotic symphony that drowned out any silent alarms. In this environment, Michael's behavior was indistinguishable from that of his peers. He did not appear agitated. He did not seem nervous or sweaty. He maintained the facade of the honor student, the good kid from a good family. This ability to compartmentalize, to sever his external presentation from his internal reality, was the most dangerous weapon he possessed. It allowed him to move through the security checkpoints of social interaction without triggering a single defense mechanism in those around him. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the first period, the window of opportunity Michael had scripted for himself began to open. The plan required isolation, a momentary break from the herd. The location had to be close, accessible, yet private enough to complete the task he had set for himself. He targeted the second-floor restroom, a space that during class time would be quiet, a tile and concrete box removed from the eyes of teachers and security guards. The manipulation required to get Jaime into that space was subtle. It relied entirely on the social contract of their friendship. Michael did not need to use force to lure his victim. He only needed to ask. A simple request, a nod, a suggestion to stop by the bathroom before class. These were the mundane tools he used to guide Jaime toward the trap. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the setting. Southwood Middle School was a place of learning and safety, a sanctuary where parents believed their children were protected. The architecture was designed for education, with bright classrooms and open courtyards. The presence of a killer within those walls, particularly one who looked so much like the victims he targeted, was a concept that the human mind struggles to accept. We are conditioned to believe that monsters look like monsters, that danger comes with a warning label. Michael Hernandez proved that the face of a killer could be the face of a boy sitting in the next desk, a boy who raised his hand in class and ate lunch in the cafeteria. He proved that the boundary between a normal school day and a crime scene is often defined not by external intruders, but by the unseen currents within the human mind. As they walked toward the bathroom, the noise of the hallway began to fade. The bell was imminent, sending other students scrambling for their seats. The corridor thinned out. Michael walked with purpose, his backpack heavy, his mind fixed on a goal that defied all logic of self-preservation or empathy. He was not thinking about the consequences of getting caught, or the life he was about to extinguish. He was thinking about the validation of his own dark obsession, a desire to cross a threshold that most people cannot even conceive. Jamie walked beside him, unsuspecting, carrying his own books, his mind likely on the violin practice or the first period class. He walked with the lightness of the innocent, unaware that every step brought him closer to the end of his life. The door to the bathroom swung open. It was a heavy door, the kind found in institutions everywhere. They stepped inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh clinical glare on the stalls and sinks. The air smelled of industrial cleaner. It was 8 a.m. The school day was just beginning. Outside, the world continued to turn. Teachers took roll calls, announcements crackled over the PA system, and the sun climbed higher over Miami. Inside the bathroom, the facade was about to drop. The face of the middle schooler, the honor student, the best friend, was about to vanish, replaced by the visage of something entirely different. The mask Michael Hernandez had worn so successfully was no longer necessary. In the quiet of that tiled room, with his best friend standing just a few feet away, Michael prepared to reveal the person he believed he was truly meant to be. The backpack was unzipped. The transformation was complete. To understand why two eighth-grade boys walked into that bathroom stall and why only one would walk out, one must look away from the sterile hallway of Southwood Middle School and examine the contents of a cluttered backpack slung over Michael Hernandez's shoulder. Inside, amidst textbooks and homework assignments, rested a spiral-bound notebook that contained a roadmap to murder. This was not a sudden snap of violence or a crime of passion. The events of the 3rd of February 2004 had been rehearsed, revised, and scripted in a chilling manifesto Michael referred to as his journal. For months, the 14-year-old honor student had been living a bifurcated existence. To his parents, Manny and Kathy Hernandez, he was a quiet, intelligent boy who did well in school and caused no trouble. To his teachers, he was polite and unassuming. But within the pages of his journal, Michael Hernandez was cultivating a persona that bore no resemblance to the awkward adolescent seen in the cafeteria. He viewed himself not as a student, but as a predator in training, an entity separate from and superior to the humanity surrounding him. He wrote of a desire to purge the world, to cleanse it, and to establish himself as a notorious figure in the annals of criminal history. The journal served as both a diary of his dark impulses and a logistical planning document. In handwriting that was neat and methodical, Michael outlined his ambitions. He did not aspire to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. His heroes were not athletes or astronauts. Michael idolized the monsters of American history. He studied the methodologies of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer with the academic rigor one might apply to a biology project. He obsessed over the films The Silence of the Lambs and American Psycho, not as entertainment, but as instructional material. He wanted to know what it felt like to hold the power of life and death in his hands, and he was determined to transition from observer to participant. Central to this transformation was a specific list found within the notebook, a page titled People to Die. It was a hit list, pragmatic and cold. It did not contain the names of bullies who had tormented him or enemies who had wronged him. Instead, it listed his friends. Michael had calculated that the easiest victims to acquire would be the ones who trusted him the most. At the top of this list were two names, Andre Martin and Jamie Goff. These were boys who sat with him at lunch, who shared his classes, and who regarded him as a close companion. In Michael's twisted logic, their friendship was a tactical weakness he could exploit. They would follow him anywhere, including a secluded bathroom stall, without suspicion. The preparation went beyond mere lists. Michael treated the impending murder as a scientific experiment. He researched human anatomy, specifically targeting the neck and the jugular vein. He understood that speed and silence were paramount if he were to avoid detection in a busy middle school. He sketched out the layout of the school, identifying blind spots and times when supervision was lax. The bathroom near the band room was chosen for its relative isolation during first period, a time when most students would be seated in class. The journal detailed a step-by-step choreography for the killing. The entries read like a mundane to-do list, juxtaposing the trivial with the horrific. He noted the time he would need to ask for a hall pass. He scripted the conversation he would use to lure his victim out of the classroom. He wrote reminders to bring a change of clothes or a jacket to cover blood spatter. He reminded himself to wash his hands. The entries revealed a mind completely detached from the moral weight of his actions. Killing his best friend was treated with the same emotional detachment as taking out the trash or finishing a math problem. In the days leading up to February 3, the pressure within Michael began to mount. The planning phase was over. Execution was the only remaining step. The journal reveals that Jaime Goff was not the exclusive target, nor was he necessarily the first choice. Initially, Michael had set his sights on Andre Martin. On a day prior to the murder, Michael had attempted to initiate his plan with Andre. He had brought the knife to school, a serrated blade he had taken from his kitchen, and tried to maneuver Andre into a vulnerable position. However, circumstances did not align. Andre had hesitated, or the hallway was too crowded, or the timing felt off. Michael, demonstrating the patience of a hunter, aborted the attempt. He simply returned the knife to his bag and went back to class, the urge to kill deferred but not diminished. This failure to launch against Andre did not deter Michael. It merely shifted the crosshairs. If Andre was unavailable, Jaime was the alternative. The interchangeability of the victims underscored the lack of personal animosity. Michael did not hate Jaime. He did not want Jaime dead because of a grudge. He wanted Jaime dead because he needed a body to validate his self-conception as a killer. Jaime was simply the vessel through which Michael would achieve his grim self-actualization. The build-up was also marked by a disturbing confidence. Michael believed he could outsmart the adults around him. He believed he could kill, clean up, and return to class without anyone realizing what had happened. His journal contained delusional projections of a life as a serial killer, traveling from state to state, leaving a trail of bodies, always one step ahead of the law. He viewed the school murder not as the end of his life as a free citizen, but as the grand opening of his career. He wrote about his mission and his purpose, using quasi-religious language to elevate his barbarism into a calling. On the morning of the murder, the physical preparations matched the written ones. Michael dressed for school like any other day, but in his pocket and backpack were the tools of his intended trade. He carried a pair of gloves to prevent leaving fingerprints. though he would ultimately discard this precaution in the heat of the moment. He had the knife, hidden carefully. He entered Southwood Middle School with the weight of the secret pressing on him, a secret that thrilled him. As he walked the halls, exchanging pleasantries with teachers and nodding to classmates, he was running the script through his mind. He saw Jaime Goff in their first period civics class. Jamie, a bespectacled, gentle boy known for his violin playing and bright smile, had no reason to suspect that the boy sitting near him had spent the previous night mentally rehearsing his execution. The banal environment of the classroom, with its rows of desks and chalkboard lessons, provided the perfect camouflage. Michael waited for the right moment. The lull in activity when asking to go to the bathroom would seem routine. The interaction was brief. Michael suggested they cut class or go to the bathroom. He needed Jaime to come with him. It was a request born of friendship, or so Jaime thought. It was the lure. The journal had predicted this success. It had counted on the bond between them to override any rule, following hesitation Jaime might have had. When Jaime agreed, standing up from his desk, he validated Michael's planning. The entrapment was successful. As they walked together through the hallways, Michael's hand remained close to his backpack. Every step was a confirmation of the reality he had built on paper. The fantasy was bleeding into the real world. The noise of the school faded into the background, replaced by the tunnel vision of the predator. Michael was not nervous in the traditional sense. He was focused. The buildup of weeks, the diagrams, the lists, the anatomical studies, the failed attempts had all funneled down to this single walk. He was bringing his journal to life. The boy walking beside him was no longer Jaime Goff, the friend who liked video games and played the violin. In Michael's eyes, Jaime had been reduced to an object, a necessary sacrifice required to unlock the door to Michael's true potential. The disconnect was absolute. There was no hesitation fueled by shared memories or childhood camaraderie. There was only the plan. They reached the restroom near the band room. It was the location Michael had scouted, the one he knew would be empty. He checked the surroundings. The coast was clear. The world outside the bathroom continued its rhythmic march buses dropping off late students, secretaries answering phones, the sun casting long morning shadows across the pavement. But inside Michael's mind, the clock had stopped. The time for writing was over. The narrative he had meticulously crafted in the solitude of his bedroom was about to reach its violent climax. He ushered Jaime inside. The heavy door swung shut behind them, sealing the two boys in the small, tiled space. The air was still. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The build-up was complete. All that remained was the act itself. Michael Hernandez looked at his friend, not with affection, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a butcher who had finally brought his work to the table. The knife was in his bag, the script was in his head, and the victim was within reach. The journal had promised him power, and in that quiet bathroom, Michael Hernandez prepared to take it. The heavy door of the handicap stall clicked into the locked position, isolating the two 14-year-olds from the rest of Southwood Middle School. The space was utilitarian, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale water, with tile walls that magnified the slightest sound. To Jaime Goff, this was a momentary detour, a secretive conversation, or an exchange of something trivial between best friends before the bell rang for first period. He stood waiting, trusting the boy he had known since elementary school, unaware that the parameters of their friendship had been unilaterally rewritten. Michael Hernandez stood between Jamie and the latch. The backpack, which had been a constant weight on his shoulder that morning, was set down or shifted to allow access. Inside the bag lay the tools he had selected with chilling pragmatism, a pair of gloves and a serrated hunting knife. He did not put on the gloves. In the condensed timeline of the plan, or perhaps due to a lapse in his own rigid script, he reached directly for the weapon. The silence in the stall was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the ventilation system and the muffled noise of hundreds of students moving through the corridors outside. The transition from stillness to violence was instantaneous. There was no argument, no heated exchange of words to signal the aggression. Hernandez withdrew the knife. The blade, sharp and jagged, caught the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom. Jamie's reaction time was severed by the sheer implausibility of the threat. In the sociology of a middle school bathroom, threats usually came in the form of shoves or jeers, not drawn weapons held by a best friend. Hernandez struck. The first blow was not a hesitation cut or a tentative test of resolve. It was committed with the intent to end a life. The knife found its mark, piercing the fabric of Jaime's shirt and entering his flesh. The shock of the impact likely registered before the pain. In that confined space, roughly 5 feet by 5 feet, there was nowhere to run. The handicapped stall, designed for accessibility, became a cage. Jaime scrambled, his instincts finally overriding his confusion, but Hernandez pressed the attack with a mechanical ferocity. The geography of the stall dictated the struggle. Jaime was backed against the toilet and the partitions, his hands raising in a desperate, futile attempt to ward off the blade. These defensive wounds, later catalogued by medical examiners, told the story of a boy realizing his mortality in real time. He fought to grab the knife, to push Michael away, but the aggressor was relentless. Hernandez did not stop at 1 or 2 thrusts. He stabbed Jaime over 40 times. The violence was excessive, a frenzied release of the dark fantasies Hernandez had been nurturing in his journals. He targeted the chest, the back, and the neck, seeking to dismantle the human being in front of him until he resembled the inanimate victims of the horror films he idolized. The physical reality of the assault was messy and chaotic. Blood began to cover the tile floor, slick and expanding rapidly. It splashed onto the partition walls and soaked into Jaime's clothing. The sounds of the struggle, the scuffling of sneakers on wet tile, the dull thud of bodies hitting the metal dividers, the ragged breathing were contained within the concrete block walls of the restroom. It is a testament to the ambient noise of a busy school morning that the commotion went unnoticed, or perhaps uninvestigated, by anyone who might have passed the outer door. Hernandez culminated the attack with a final, deliberate act. He drew the blade across Jaime's throat, severing the airway and major blood vessels. The struggle ceased. Jaime collapsed onto the cold floor of the stall, his body wedged in the narrow space between the toilet and the wall. The rhythmic march of the outside world continued, but inside the stall, the only rhythm left was the slowing beat of a dying heart and the heavy respiration of the killer. Michael Hernandez stood over the body of his best friend. The adrenaline of the act was coursing through him, but his behavior did not dissolve into panic. This was the moment he had rehearsed in his mind. He looked at the carnage he had created. He checked his own person. Remarkably, the blood had not soaked his clothing to a degree that was immediately obvious to a casual observer, or perhaps his mind simply filtered out the risk. He wiped the blade. The knife, now coated in the evidence of capital murder, was not discarded in the trash or left on the floor. He deliberately placed it back into his backpack, sliding it into a hidden pocket, preserving the instrument of his perceived transformation. He waited a moment, listening. The bathroom remained empty. He unlatched the stall door. Stepping out, he left Jaime lying in the expanding pool of blood, the door swinging shut but not locking, leaving the horror just inches away from the public space. Hernandez walked to the sink. He checked his face and hands in the mirror. He looked like the same student who had entered minutes prior, perhaps slightly flushed, but composed. The mask of sanity was firmly back in place. He exited the bathroom. The hallway was beginning to clear as the first bell approached. Students were filing into classrooms, lockers were slamming shut, and teachers were ushering stragglers along. Hernandez merged into this stream of normalcy. He walked with the backpack containing the murder weapon slung over his shoulder, the weight of it bumping against his spine with every step. He navigated the corridors of Southwood Middle School, passing peers and faculty members who saw only a quiet, slightly awkward teenager, not a killer leaving the scene of a butchery. He arrived at his first period classroom. The teacher was already present. Other students were taking their seats, unpacking books and pens. Hernandez walked to his desk and sat down. The dissonance was absolute. Minutes ago he had been engaged in a primal, bloody struggle. Now he was seated in an academic environment, preparing for a lesson. He did not scream. He did not cry. He did not run to the principal's office to confess a terrible mistake. He sat. He waited. He observed the routine of the morning, maintaining a terrifying composure that would later disturb investigators and psychologists alike. Back in the second-floor bathroom, the scene lay dormant for only a short time. The bell rang, the halls emptied. The silence of the school day settled in. Around 8:30 a.m., another student pushed open the heavy door of the restroom. He walked in, intending to use the facilities. The air in the room had changed. The metallic scent of blood was likely palpable. The student moved toward the stalls. His eyes were drawn to the handicap stall at the end of the row. Beneath the gap of the partition, the white tile was no longer white. A dark, viscous liquid was pooling, creeping outward from the enclosed space. He saw sneakers. They were not moving. The stillness was wrong. The student approached, perhaps calling out, perhaps paralyzed by the rising dread. He peered through the crack or pushed the door slightly ajar. The visual shock was overwhelming. Jaime Goff lay crumpled, his body destroyed, the blood vividly contrasting with the institutional beige and gray of the restroom. The student recoiled, the reality of the sight scrambling his senses. He turned and ran. He burst out of the bathroom and into the empty hallway, his shouts shattering the quiet of the academic wing. He found a school monitor, breathless and terrified, pointing back toward the restroom, unable to articulate the magnitude of what lay inside. School resource officers and administrators rushed to the scene. They entered the bathroom with a sense of urgency that quickly turned to horror. This was not a fight. This was not a medical emergency in the traditional sense. This was a crime scene. The stall was secured. The area was cordoned off. The radio calls went out code red, lockdown, police emergency. The school, which had been operating on its normal schedule, began to grind to a halt. In his classroom, Michael Hernandez heard the commotion. He watched as the administration moved into crisis mode. He likely heard the sirens approaching, the wail of the ambulance, and the sharp chirp of police cruisers arriving at the front entrance. He remained in his seat. When the news began to filter through the student body whispers of something bad, something bloody in the bathroom, he feigned the same confusion and concern as his classmates. He acted the part of the bystander. When the school went into lockdown, keeping students inside their classrooms for safety, Hernandez was trapped in the room with the potential witnesses to his demeanor. He did not crack. He did not fidget uncontrollably. He kept the backpack close. The knife was right there, inches from his hand, concealed by nylon and zippers. He was inhabiting the persona he had crafted, the serial killer, who could operate in plain sight, invisible to the sheep around him. The police arrived in force. They secured the bathroom, photographing the blood-streaked walls and the tragic position of the victim. They began the process of identification. It didn't take long to determine who the boy in the stall was. Jaime Goff. An honors student, a violinist, a quiet, bespectacled boy who had simply gone to the bathroom before class. As they processed the scene, they noted the lack of a weapon. It wasn't a suicide. It wasn't an accident. The sheer number of wounds indicated rage, intimacy, and a prolonged attack. The killer had walked away with the blade. Officers began sweeping the school, unaware that the perpetrator was sitting quietly in a classroom nearby, waiting for the next phase of his plan to unfold, or simply watching the chaos he had orchestrated. The blood on Hernandez's jacket, unnoticed in the dim light of the stall or the rush of the hallway, began to dry, a silent testament to the violence that had just occurred. The gap between the discovery of the body and the identification of the suspect was closing, but in those interim minutes, Michael Hernandez existed in a liminal space where he believed he had succeeded. He had taken a life. He had walked away. He was, in his own mind, exactly who he wanted to be. The bathroom stall remained a silent witness to the betrayal, the final image of Jaime Goff forever frozen in the cold, hard light of the morning. The frantic energy within the administrative offices of Southwood Middle School spiked just after the first bell. A student had entered the second-floor boys' restroom and immediately sprinted back out, white-faced and screaming. He had seen legs in a stall, surrounded by a widening pool of crimson. School security and administrators rushed to the scene, pushing through the lingering stragglers in the hallway, who were unaware that the atmosphere of their typical Tuesday morning had been irrevocably shattered. When the first adult entered the restroom, the metallic scent of blood was overpowering. Inside the handicap stall, they found Jamie Goff lifeless on the tile floor. The brutality of the scene was immediately apparent to the first responders. This was not a playground fight that had gone too far, nor was it a tragic accident. The sheer volume of blood and the nature of the visible injuries suggested a catastrophic targeted violence. The school resource officer immediately initiated a code red lockdown. Over the public address system, the announcement crackled, ordering all teachers to lock their doors and keep students inside. The bustling noise of a middle school with over 1,500 students instantly evaporated, replaced by the ominous sound of keys turning in locks and lights flicking off. Inside the classrooms, confusion reigned. Students huddled under desks or in corners, whispering rumors about a shooter or a bomb, unaware that the danger had already passed and was, in fact, sitting among them. Michael Hernandez sat at his desk in his first-period computer class. To his classmates and his teacher, nothing appeared amiss. He did not seem agitated, frantic, or fearful. He did not have the demeanor of a 14-year-old boy who had just savagely ended the life of his best friend a few hundred feet away. He sat quietly, his hands resting near his lap, his breathing steady. However, the physical evidence of his actions was not entirely concealed. He was wearing a jacket, a windbreaker that seemed out of place once the students were settled in the climate-controlled room. Back at the crime scene, Miami-Dade police homicide detectives were arriving in force. The school had become a sealed crime scene. Yellow tape crisscrossed the hallways, and forensic technicians in protective suits began the grim task of processing the restroom. They noted the footprint patterns in the blood, looking for a trail that might lead them out of the bathroom. They needed to identify the victim quickly to understand who might have wanted to hurt him. It did not take long to identify Jaime Goff. With the victim's identity established, the investigation pivoted instantly to his known associates. In a middle school ecosystem, violence is almost always personal. Detectives asked the administration who Jamie's friends were, who he walked to class with, and where he was supposed to be. The name Michael Hernandez came up immediately. They were best friends. They were often seen together. The logic was standard police procedure. Find the best friend, inform him, or ask if he saw anything unusual that morning. Administrators and officers began a room-to-room search, checking rosters to locate Hernandez. They were not yet hunting a suspect. They were looking for a witness. They located Hernandez in his classroom. As the school officials and a police officer entered the room, the tension among the other students spiked. The officer approached Michael, asking him to step outside. As Michael stood up, the discrepancy in his appearance became visible. The lighting in the classroom was brighter than the dim stall of the restroom. On his jacket there were stains. Dark, reddish-brown smears disrupted the fabric's pattern. The officer's focus sharpened. He asked Michael about the stains. Michael, without skipping a beat or showing a flicker of panic, replied that he had gotten red paint on himself in art class. It was a quick, improvised lie, but it was structurally flawed. It was early in the morning. Most students hadn't been to art class yet, and the consistency of the stain did not look like tempera or acrylic paint. It looked like dried blood. The metallic smell that had permeated the bathroom also clung faintly to the boy. Law enforcement immediately escalated the encounter. They separated Michael from the general population, escorting him into the hallway and then to a secure administrative office. The pretense of him being merely a witness evaporated. The boy in the jacket was now the primary person of interest. The search of his person and belongings commenced with the standard procedure for officer safety, but the results were horrifyingly comprehensive. Inside Michael's backpack, the chaos of the bathroom was contextualized by the orderliness of his preparation. Detectives found a serrated knife. It was not a small pocket knife, but a substantial blade, capable of inflicting the deep, penetrating wounds found on Jaime. The blade was stained. He had cleaned it, but not well enough to deceive forensic analysis. Alongside the weapon, they found a pair of latex gloves. This detail shifted the narrative from a crime of passion to one of cold calculation. A 14-year-old boy does not bring latex gloves to school unless he intends to handle something he does not want to leave prints on, or unless he wants to keep his hands clean while performing a messy task. The presence of the gloves indicated that Michael had planned to kill that day. He had thought about the logistics of murder, the blood, the fingerprints, the cleanup before he even boarded the school bus. But the backpack held something even more chilling than the weapon. Officers discovered a handwritten list. It was a piece of paper that mapped out a methodical plan for death. Jaime Goff's name was on it, but he was not the only one. Another student, Andre Martin, was also listed. The notes detailed a desire to kill, to become a serial killer, to transcend the mundane life of a middle schooler and enter the realm of notorious murderers. The investigation suddenly expanded in scope. The police realized they weren't just dealing with a singular homicide. They had intercepted a budding spree killer who had successfully executed phase 1 of his plan. Michael's demeanor during the discovery of these items remained unsettlingly flat. Most 14-year-olds caught with contraband, let alone a murder weapon, would break down, cry for their parents, or hyperventilate. Hernandez did none of these things. He watched the officers pull the evidence from his bag with a detached curiosity, as if he were an observer to his own arrest rather than the subject of it. He did not scream that he was innocent. He did not invent a story about finding the knife. He simply existed in the space, maintaining a terrifying emotional distance from the gravity of the situation. As the forensic team bagged the jacket and the knife, the connection was physical and absolute. The blood on the jacket would later be DNA matched to Jaime Goff, but even in that moment, the visual evidence was damning. The sheer amount of blood transfer suggested close contact during the violence. The killer hadn't just stabbed from a distance. He had been right on top of the victim, within the spray and flow of the arterial damage. The investigation moved from the school to the Miami-Dade Police Headquarters. Hernandez was read his rights. The interrogation room was prepared. Detectives, accustomed to cracking hardened criminals or distraught domestic abusers, were now faced with a bespectacled 8th grader who looked like he should be doing homework, yet who possessed the mindset of a predator. Back at the school, the lockdown was slowly lifted, but the campus was now a crime scene. Parents had gathered outside the gates, their anxiety reaching a fever pitch as news helicopters circled overhead. The rumor mill had been replaced by the crushing reality of the news. A student was dead, stabbed to death in the bathroom. The shock was compounded by the revelation of the suspect. Michael Hernandez was not the school bully or a known delinquent. He was a quiet, high-achieving student. He was Jaime's friend. The detectives began piecing together the timeline of the morning. They learned that Michael had lured Jaime into the bathroom. It wasn't a chance encounter. Michael had initiated the interaction, convincing Jaime to skip class or step inside for a moment. He had waited for the bathroom to clear, showing a level of patience and situational awareness that belied his age. The boy in the jacket had stood there, weapon concealed, waiting for the perfect moment of isolation. The red paint lie Michael had told in the classroom was dismantled rapidly. There was no art class on his schedule that morning. The timeline didn't fit. When pressed on this during the initial containment at the school, his story fractured not because of pressure, but because the physical reality of the knife in his bag made the lie irrelevant. The jacket itself became a primary piece of forensic storytelling. The spray patterns on the fabric told the investigators exactly how Michael had stood relative to Jaime. It contradicted any potential future claims of self-defense. The blood was largely on the front and sleeves, consistent with an aggressor launching a forward attack. There were no defensive wounds on Michael, no signs of a struggle that he had lost. He was entirely uninjured. The violence had been one-sided. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of the tragedy settled over Miami-Dade. The police had their suspect, they had the weapon, and they had a confession of intent in the form of the hit list. But the why remained an abyss. The list found in the backpack referenced an obsession with movies and a desire to emulate famous killers. It suggested that Jaime was killed not out of hatred, but out of curiosity and a need to validate a delusional self-image. The transport of Michael Hernandez, from Southwood Middle School to the police station, was handled with extreme caution. He was draped in a sheet or jacket to obscure his face from the press, but the image of the small figure being led into the police cruiser became the defining visual of the day. The boy who had sat quietly in class while his best friend bled to death a few rooms away was now in custody. Inside the interrogation room, the facade of the normal middle schooler completely dissolved, not into hysteria, but into a cold rationality. The detectives prepared to ask the hardest questions, knowing that the boy sitting across from them, the boy in the blood-stained jacket, had likely planned to kill again that very day if he hadn't been caught. The contents of his backpack, specifically the presence of Andre Martin's name, indicated that Jaime was meant to be the first, not the only. The quick work of the school administration and the police in noticing the blood on his clothing had likely saved another life. The investigation had moved at lightning speed, driven by the visual cue of the jacket, transforming a chaotic code red into a closed-case homicide within hours. As the interrogation continued in the stark, windowless room, a concurrent and equally chilling discovery was taking place in the forensics lab. Detectives had seized Michael Hernandez's backpack, a standard, heavy-duty book bag that looked identical to hundreds of others roaming the hallways of Southwood Middle School. It was the artifact of a student filled with textbooks, binders, and pencils, but it was also the mobile command center of a budding killer. When investigators unzipped the main compartment, the dichotomy between child and monster lay bare. Inside, nestled among the trappings of eighth-grade academia, lay the physical manifestations of a nightmare that had been months in the making. The search yielded the immediate, visceral evidence of the crime. Stuffed hastily inside was a windbreaker jacket. The fabric was stiff, saturated with the blood of Jaime Goff. It was the garment Michael had worn during the attack, the layer of protection he had donned not for warmth, but to shield his school uniform from the arterial spray he had anticipated. The presence of the jacket was damning, a direct link placing him in the stall with the victim, but it was the weapon that provided the forensic certainty. At the bottom of the bag, investigators found the knife. It was a folding knife, substantial and serrated, the blade still retracted but stained with the drying evidence of the violence it had inflicted. The serrations on the steel matched the jagged defensive wounds found on Jaime's hands and the fatal lacerations to his neck. It was a utilitarian tool turned into an instrument of slaughter, hidden casually beneath homework assignments. However, the most disturbing item in the backpack was not the weapon that took Jaime's life, but the document that explained why. Tucked away in a spiral-bound notebook was a handwritten manifesto, a roadmap to murder that Michael had drafted with the casual demeanor of a student taking lecture notes. This was not a rant scrawled in a moment of passion or a chaotic scribble of a mind snapping under pressure. It was a list. It was a plan. It was a contract Michael Hernandez had signed with himself. The document, which would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case and the window into Michael's psyche, detailed a specific, step-by-step agenda for February 3rd. In neat, legible cursive, Michael had written out his objectives for the day. The header did not scream of rage, it spoke of efficiency. The list included the names of two specific targets, Jaime Goff and Andre Martin. These were not enemies or bullies. They were his friends. Jaime played the violin. He was quiet, studious, and trusted Michael implicitly. Andre was another close companion. The manifesto revealed that their selection was not based on animosity, but on accessibility. They were the boys Michael could lure. They were the boys who would follow him into a bathroom stall without suspicion because they believed he was their friend. The manifesto laid out the method of execution with a clinical detachment that stunned the detectives reading it. Michael had choreographed the events: lure the victim into the bathroom, wait for the opportune moment, and slit their throat. The writing indicated that he had planned to kill Andre first. The timeline reconstructed from the journal and later testimony suggested that earlier that morning, Michael had indeed tried to lure Andre into the bathroom. A simple twist of fate, Andre deciding not to go or the bell ringing, had saved his life. Jaime Goff became the primary target simply because he was the next name on the list to say yes. The interchangeability of the victims on the page underscored a horrifying reality. The person he killed mattered less than the act of killing itself. Beyond the hit list, the notebook contained writings that illuminated the scope of Michael's ambition. This was not intended to be an isolated tragedy. The journal entries revealed that Michael Hernandez did not view himself as a 14-year-old boy, but as a predator in training. He idolized the concept of the serial killer. He had studied them not with fear but with admiration. The writings referenced movies like Silence of the Lambs and American Psycho, but not as entertainment. He consumed them as instructional material. He wrote about wanting to understand the mechanics of death, to feel the sensation of taking a life, and to perfect the art of getting away with it. The murder of Jaime Goff was framed in his notes as an initiation, a test run to see if he had the stomach for the career he had chosen for himself. The preparation detailed in the notebook matched the contents of the backpack perfectly. He had listed the items he needed: the knife, the jacket to catch the blood, and a pair of latex gloves to prevent fingerprints. The gloves were found with the knife, confirming that the attack was not a sudden loss of control, but a premeditated operation. He had thought about the forensics. He had thought about the cleanup. He had thought about returning to class. The journal even contained notes on how to dispose of the body or hide the evidence, though the reality of the middle school bathroom, the time constraints, the noise, the public nature of the setting had forced him to abandon the more complex parts of his disposal plan. As investigators turned the pages, the why became increasingly abstract and terrifying. There was no mention of a slight, no revenge for a stolen girlfriend, no payback for a rumor. The motive was curiosity and compulsion. He believed he had been chosen or made different by a higher power, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in a biological one. He viewed himself as superior, a being evolved beyond the constraints of human empathy. The Manifesto was an arrogant declaration of this self-perceived status. He wrote about his desire to effectively become a god over his victims, holding the ultimate power of life and death in his hands. The entries suggested he had been thinking about this for a long time, fantasizing about the logistics of murder while sitting in math class or eating dinner with his family. The juxtaposition of the journal's content with the boy sitting in the interrogation room created a dissonance that was difficult for the authorities to reconcile. In the video feed from the interview, Michael appeared small, polite, almost bored. He answered questions with short, direct sentences. But the boy described in the journal was a monster who planned to kill his best friends and then continue his day as if nothing had happened. The evidence showed that he had almost succeeded in the second part. After killing Jaime, he had wiped the knife, hidden the jacket, and returned to his first period class. He had sat at his desk, the manifesto in his bag, the weapon at his feet, and participated in the lesson while Jaime lay dead just down the hall. The handwriting analysis confirmed that Michael was the sole author of the plan. There was no coercion, no second party dictating the moves. The phrasing was consistent with his speech patterns, yet stripped of any social filter. He wrote about his sister too, and his parents, casting a wide net of potential violence that extended far beyond the school grounds. The journal indicated that if the school killing went well, if he felt the rush he anticipated, the violence would escalate. He had aspirations of a body count, of becoming a name that history would remember alongside the infamous killers he studied. This evidence dismantled any potential defense of temporary insanity or a crime of passion. Passion is hot, it is reactive and chaotic. The notebook was cold. It was a calculated logistical strategy. The check marks next to the items he needed, the specific order of operations, and the contingency plans for if he was interrupted demonstrated a functioning, rational mind, applying its logic to an irrational, horrific goal. The knife was the tool, but the manifesto was the true weapon. It proved that the intent to kill existed long before Michael and Jaime walked into the bathroom. It proved that Jaime was dead before he even woke up that morning, condemned by a list written by the boy he trusted most. The discovery of the list rippled through the investigation, shifting the tone from an inquiry into a juvenile tragedy to a homicide investigation of the highest order. It provided the prosecutors with the mens rea, the guilty mind. They didn't have to guess what Michael was thinking. He had written it down. He had signed his name to the brutality. The notes regarding Andre Martin were particularly harrowing, as they confirmed that the tragedy could easily have been a double homicide. The only thing that stood between Andre and the fate Jaime suffered was a whim, a matter of timing that Michael had noted with frustration in his writings. As the detectives bagged the journal, sealing it in plastic evidence bags, they knew they were holding the darkest corners of a child's mind. The knife would match the wounds, the blood would match the DNA, but the journal matched the soul of the killer. It explained the unexplainable calmness Michael displayed. He wasn't in shock because nothing that happened was a surprise to him. He had written the script, he had rehearsed the scene in his mind, and he had executed it according to the production schedule found in his backpack. The tragedy was not that a child had snapped, but that a child had so carefully, methodically, and remorselessly broken the world around him. The investigation ultimately transitioned into a legal process that would span more than a decade, testing the endurance of the Goff family and the community's sense of justice. Following the discovery of the journal and the weapon, the legal machinery moved with a grim determination. In 2008, 4 years after the murder in the middle school bathroom, a jury rejected the defense's claims of insanity. They found Michael Hernandez guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Jaime Go and attempted first-degree murder for the plot against Andre Martin. The initial sentence was swift and absolute: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a time, it seemed the book was closed, the dangerous adolescent locked away where his dark fixations could no longer harm the public. However, the legal landscape for juvenile offenders shifted dramatically in 2012. The United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in Miller v. 2nd, Alabama, declaring that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. The decision was retroactive, meaning thousands of offenders across the country, including Hernandez, became eligible for resentencing hearings. This legal technicality forced the Goff family to relive their nightmare. They had to return to court, not to determine guilt, but to argue once again why the man who killed their son should never walk free. The resentencing hearing convened in 2016. Michael Hernandez was no longer the 14-year-old boy with the vacant stare who had shocked the nation. He was now 26 years old. His appearance changed, but the central question before Miami-Dade Circuit Judge John Schlesinger remained the same. Was he capable of rehabilitation, or did he remain a threat to society? The defense team aimed to portray Hernandez as a reformed individual, someone who had matured past the violent impulses of his youth. They argued that his brain had been undeveloped at the time of the crime, and that with proper treatment, he could eventually reintegrate into society. They sought a reduction in his sentence that would offer him a release date. The prosecution, however, had spent the months leading up to the hearing gathering evidence that would dismantle the image of a reformed prisoner. They did not need to rely solely on the brutal facts of the 2004 murder, though those remained impactful. Instead, they turned to a new source of insight into Hernandez's mind: his own voice. Prosecutors introduced hours of recorded jailhouse phone calls captured between Hernandez and a woman he had been communicating with, as well as calls to his family. These recordings, played in open court, chilled the room and effectively erased the 12 years of supposed maturation the defense had tried to establish. In these calls, the courtroom heard a man who did not sound burdened by remorse or haunted by the life he had taken. Instead, they heard a man who remained deeply entrenched in the same morbid fascinations that had filled his middle school journal. Hernandez was heard speaking casually, often jokingly, about the murder and his status as a killer. He discussed his continued obsession with death metal music, specifically tracks that featured violent, graphic lyrics about killing and mutilation. He did not speak of these things with detachment, but with the enthusiasm of a fan, demonstrating that the violent imagery that fueled his adolescent fantasies still provided him with gratification in adulthood. One specific conversation played for the court proved particularly damaging to the defense's narrative of remorse. Hernandez was recorded laughing about his behavior during the original trial in 2008. He admitted to the woman on the phone that he had manipulated the courtroom by crying on cue to garner sympathy. He mocked the emotional gravity of the proceedings, revealing that the tears the jury had seen were a calculated performance rather than an expression of genuine sorrow. This admission struck at the heart of the judicial process, painting Hernandez not as a confused child who made a terrible mistake, but as a manipulative sociopath who viewed the court not as a place of judgment, but as a stage for his deception. The prosecutors also highlighted his lack of empathy for the Goff family. In the recordings, Hernandez complained about the inconvenience the legal proceedings caused him, focusing entirely on his own discomfort and the disruption to his routine. He referred to the murder of his best friend in clinical, detached terms, stripped of any emotional weight. He spoke of his interest in serial killers and mass murderers, not as cautionary tales, but as figures of intrigue, mirroring the hit list mindset he had possessed at 14. The recordings revealed that while his physical environment had been restricted to a cell, his mental landscape remained a playground of violent ideation. Forensic psychologists and psychiatrists took the stand to interpret this data. The prosecution's experts argued that Hernandez exhibited classic traits of psychopathy, superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, and a profound lack of remorse or guilt. They posited that these were not merely symptoms of a troubled adolescence that he would grow out of, but ingrained personality characteristics that made him permanently dangerous. The defense experts tried to counter this by discussing brain development and the potential for change, but the audio evidence of Hernandez's own voice provided a real-time rebuttal to their theoretical arguments. The impact on the victims' families was palpable. Jaime Goff's parents, Jorge and Maria, sat in the courtroom, listening to the man who killed their son chuckle about his crime. The pain was compounded by the presence of Andre Martin, the boy who had narrowly escaped death that day in 2004. Martin, now an adult and a police officer, testified about the lasting trauma of knowing he was on the list, a target of the same cold calculation that had claimed Jaime. The realization that Hernandez still harbored these dark thoughts terrified them. They pleaded with the judge to ensure that he would never have the opportunity to harm another person. The legal arguments concluded with a stark comparison. The defense asked the court to look at the man Hernandez could become, while the prosecution asked the court to look at the man he clearly still was. They argued that releasing him would be a gamble with the highest possible stakes, one where the lives of innocent people would be the wager. They pointed to the journal from 2004 and the phone calls from 2015 and 2016, drawing a straight line between them. The medium had changed from pen and paper to recorded digital audio, but the message was identical. Judge John Schlesinger took time to review the mountains of evidence, the transcripts of the calls, and the expert testimony. When he returned to deliver his ruling, the courtroom was silent with anticipation. The judge's analysis was methodical. He acknowledged the changes in the law regarding juvenile sentencing and the necessity of considering an offender's potential for rehabilitation. However, he stated that rehabilitation requires a recognition of wrongdoing and a genuine change in character, neither of which he found in the evidence before him. Schlesinger focused heavily on the prison calls. He noted the casual cruelty in Hernandez's tone and his continued fixation on violence. The judge cited the defendant's own words against him, pointing out that Hernandez had not spent his time in prison reflecting on the loss of Jaime Goff or striving to become a moral person. Instead, he had spent his time preserving the very identity that had led to the murder. The judge dismantled the defense's argument of maturity, noting that while Hernandez had physically aged, his emotional and moral development appeared to be frozen in the moment of the crime. Then came the definitive statement that would headline the legal outcome. Judge Schlesinger looked at the defendant and declared, "He is the same person." This sentence encapsulated the court's finding that Michael Hernandez had not evolved. The judge elaborated that the danger Hernandez posed to the community had not diminished with time. The underlying pathology that allowed a 14-year-old to lure his best friend into a bathroom stall and stab him over 40 times was still present in the 26-year-old man sitting at the defense table. The judge emphasized that the court's primary responsibility was the safety of the public. Releasing Hernandez, or even setting a future date for release, would fundamentally violate that duty given the overwhelming evidence of his continued sociopathic tendencies. The judge effectively reinstated the life sentence. Technically, under the new sentencing guidelines, he sentenced Hernandez to life in prison for the murder of Jaime Goff. He acknowledged that while the law required a review, the review had confirmed the necessity of the maximum penalty. For the attempted murder of Andre Martin, Hernandez received an additional sentence to be served consecutively, further ensuring that the possibility of freedom was extinguished. The ruling was a massive relief to the Goff family, who wept as the decision was read. They had feared that the legal technicalities would override the reality of their son's murder, but the court had validated their fears. The killer had not changed. The same person, ruling, served as a rare legal instance where a defendant's post-conviction behavior so thoroughly sabotaged their chance for leniency. Usually, defense teams can curate a narrative of growth and redemption over a decade of incarceration. Hernandez, however, had provided the prosecution with the ultimate weapon against himself. His arrogance, believing he could outsmart the system or that his private conversations would remain private, exposed the truth that no psychiatric evaluation could fully capture. He had not been rehabilitated because he did not believe there was anything wrong with him to begin with. Following the resentencing, Hernandez was returned to the Florida Department of Corrections to continue serving his life term. The outcome solidified the narrative of the case in the public eye. It was no longer just a tragedy of a child killing a child, it was a case study in the persistence of psychopathy. The legal system, often criticized for being rigid or bureaucratic, had in this instance functioned as a precise instrument of truth-finding. By listening to the defendant, the court had looked past the passage of time and seen the unchanging nature of the threat. The story of Michael Hernandez's legal journey ended not with a bang, but with a confirmation of the status quo. He would remain behind bars, an inmate obsessed with the macabre, separated from a world he viewed only as a setting for his violent fantasies. The judicial affirmation that he was the same person stood as the final word on his character, a legal epitaph that would follow him for the remainder of his days in custody. There would be no redemption arc, no parole, and no second act. The boy who wrote of murder in his diary had become the man who laughed about it on the phone, and the law ensured he would die in the prison that had become his only stage. The ruling in 2016 effectively sealed the legal narrative, but the physical reality of Michael Hernandez's incarceration continued. He returned to the Columbia Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility roughly 4 hours north of the Miami suburbs, where he had destroyed 2 families. With his life sentence reaffirmed, and the possibility of parole stripped away by his own recorded words, Hernandez settled into the routine of an inmate who would never leave. The prison calls that had damned him in court conversations filled with chuckles about stabbing techniques and admiration for other killers ceased to be evidence and became merely the soundtrack of his stagnant existence. He was 31 years old, legally an adult, but mentally suspended in the violent fantasies of a 14-year-old boy. For the next 5 years, the case remained quiet. The media frenzy that had surrounded the initial trial and the resentencing hearing dissipated, leaving only the slow, grinding passage of time. Hernandez's physical appearance changed drastically during this period. The thin, bespectacled teenager who had sat stone-faced in the courtroom had grown into a heavy, imposing man. His weight had ballooned, a physical manifestation of a sedentary life confined within concrete walls. While the world outside moved on, Hernandez remained a fixture of the Florida Department of Corrections, just another number in a system designed to incapacitate those deemed too dangerous for society. The silence broke on the 29th of April, 2021. Inside the prison, surveillance cameras captured Hernandez, walking near the orderly station. There was no confrontation, no weapon, and no dramatic standoff. He simply collapsed. Medical staff within the facility responded immediately, attempting life-saving measures, but he could not be revived. The cause of death was later determined to be cardiac dysrhythmia attributed to morbid obesity. The boy who had obsessed over violent, bloody endings, who had meticulously planned to become a prolific serial killer, had died not in a hail of gunfire or a prison riot, but from a sudden, quiet failure of his own heart. When the news reached Miami, It brought a complex wave of emotions for those who had lived in Hernandez's shadow for 17 years. Jorge and Maria Goff, the parents of Jaime Goff, received the notification that the man who murdered their son was dead. For nearly 2 decades, their lives had been punctuated by legal motions, appeals, and hearings. They had been forced to repeatedly relive the worst day of their lives, listening to descriptions of their son's final moments and hearing the killer's unrepentant voice. The death of Hernandez meant the immediate and permanent end of that cycle. There would be no more appeals. There would be no future hearings where they would have to beg a judge to keep him locked away. Jorge Goff spoke to the press with a demeanor of exhausted relief. He clarified that the family took no joy in the death of a human being, but they felt a profound sense of closure. The anxiety that had lingered in the back of their minds, the irrational but persistent fear that a legal loophole might one day set him free, evaporated. The death of Michael Hernandez did not bring Jaime back, but it removed the final tether binding the Goffs to the judicial system. They were finally free to mourn their son without the distraction of his killer's legal maneuvers. The autopsy and the closing of the inmate file marked the biological end of the obsession that had begun in a middle school bathroom in 2004. Hernandez's legacy was one of wasted potential and profound tragedy. Psychologists and criminologists had studied him as a rare example of a juvenile offender who exhibited the crystallized traits of a psychopath, traits that resisted time, maturity, and incarceration. His death left those clinical questions unanswered, cutting short any further study into the progression of his pathology. The notebook he had kept as a teenager, the list of names he had targeted, and the prison phone calls became historical artifacts rather than active threats. In the years following Hernandez's death, the focus shifted entirely to the memory of Jaime Goff. The Southwood Middle School community, which had been permanently scarred by the violence, had long since renovated the bathroom where the attack occurred, physically erasing the site of the trauma. A memorial bench and a tree planted in Jaime's honor remained, serving as a quiet testament to the gentle violin-playing student whose life was stolen. The Goff family continued to honor their son through their faith and community, choosing to remember his smile and his music rather than the brutality of his death. The case stands as a grim reference point in the debate over juvenile justice. It challenged the prevailing belief that all children are capable of rehabilitation. The legal system's final judgment that Michael Hernandez was the same person at 26 as he was at 14 was vindicated by the static nature of his character until his death. He never evolved, never expressed genuine remorse, and never shed the dark fascinations that drove him to kill. His passing was the final punctuation mark on a story that was devoid of redemption. Ultimately, the legacy of this tragedy is not the killer's infamy, which will fade with time, but the resilience of the Goff family. They survived the unimaginable, navigated a labyrinthine legal system, and stood firm in their demand for justice while maintaining their dignity. The obsession that consumed Michael Hernandez died with him in that prison corridor, leaving behind a silence that finally allowed the wounds of the past to turn into scars permanent, visible, but no longer bleeding. The story ended as it began, with a stark contrast between two lives, one defined by love and lost potential, and the other by a cold, consuming darkness that eventually extinguished itself.